from America. He is a professor of anthropology and folklore. For 9 years he's worked at Champlain in Burlington. He's written a book called The Norwegian Scots, so some of you may be familiar with his work already. And he's done a tremendous amount of ethnographic fieldwork in Orkney. And today he is going to speak about conceptualized landscape and epistemological meaning. Thank you, Mike.
Hi there. First, half confession, half apology. I am terrible at creating a linear presentation, so I have some ideas up here that I'm going to talk about. Becky is much better, as you just saw, at laying out a line of thought in a very sort of practice structured way. I'm not. So I'm just going to talk a little bit in my funny accent at you and hopefully generate a little bit of conversation. I'd like to start by pulling on one of the ideas that Becky uses an awful lot in her research, the concept of the Bactidian dialogic. The idea of communication being a conversive and cooperative thing. A lot of communication studies pull on that idea in some form or fashion, and it's a pretty straightforward understanding at its base. In order to communicate, you need somebody communicating out, you need somebody communicating in, and you need the interaction of those two to make communication actually happen. Right? Fair enough. One of the phrases, I actually scribbled this down in the keynote upstairs from Carla Massey. She was quoting Angela Byrne, talking about the concept of northern landscape mythologies. That's an evocative phrase for me, northern landscape mythologies. I'm actually going to rope you all in to be part of my talk here. Somebody talking about what is a mythology? What does that term mean to you? That's not a rhetorical question. I'm actually looking for an answer here.
About how the landscape was created in the first place and populated.
You're actually answering my next question. But just the term mythology itself, what does that term mean to you? What is a mythology?
Created story.
Created story. Keep talking. What do you mean by created here?
Okay, I'm an archaeologist.
I used to be an archaeologist too. I'm with you.
So I see it as something that I don't have access to in archaeology, but the stories that people would have told each other to make sense of the world.
Excellent. A story people tell in order to make sense of the world. And when you use the phrase make sense of, I'm going to rephrase that slightly. Make meaning with. Would that be a fair way to capture what you're talking about? Absolutely. Mythologies are stories. Stories that are created, and the term myth has taken on a meaning of falseness, and that's a fair enough use of the term. But whether it's true or false is kind of irrelevant, because the thing that makes myth is that it's a story that people use to make meaning of the world around them, right? So when Angela Byrne talks about northern landscape mythologies, I want to explore a little bit about what that actually means. When you were talking about, you talked an awful lot about how people narrate about the landscape, how people dialogize about the landscape, how they use the landscape as a thing about which to discourse, right? We make meaning with our surroundings by talking about it. It's sort of oversimplification, but the basic idea of us talking about our landscape in order to make meaning of it makes some sense, right? If I'm going to communicate to you about something, one of the things that we might communicate about is our shared surroundings. And we can then make meaning of those surroundings by sharing our dialogic process about them. Okay. I'm going to read a couple chunks from a book called Wisdom Sits in Places. This is by an anthropologist named Keith Basso. I don't have a fancy slide with my citations on it, so if anybody wants this, let me know. I'll give you the cite info when we're done. Keith Basso is an anthropologist who did research in Arizona in the United States among a group called the Sebique Apache. It's a Native American group. You probably are familiar with the term Apache. Sebique is just one particular flavor of Apache. It's a technical term, flavor. This is Basso talking a little bit about how he's understanding how the Sebique Apache dialogize about their landscape. To gain an understanding of this practice, of them talking to one another, and the sources of its coherence for Western Apache people, I shall assume that spoken discourse is a cooperative activity in which individuals seek to accomplish a range of communicative purposes. Very Bakhtinian sort of understanding. People communicate by spitting out words and bringing them in, and they share that process. I shall also assume that participants in many kinds of discourse use language to explore with each other the significance of past and potential events. The significance of past and potential events, making meaning with their surroundings. Drawing from these examinations certain consequences for the present and future actions. That last phrase is really powerful, because the mythologizing and the dialogizing that's going on here when talking about the landscape is not just used to make meaning of the landscape. It is also drawing from these examinations certain consequences for the present and future actions. It becomes constitutive. It shapes people interacting with each other and with the landscape. When you and I are dialogizing about the landscape around us, we're not just making the meaning of it, we are creating meanings for ourselves to continue to move within that landscape. And you saw an awful lot of that in Becky's presentation. People in Orkney are negotiating renewable energy. Can you think of anything that's more futuristic than renewable energy? When you look at the machines, the oyster and the sea snake, they look like things out of Star Trek. They look futuristic partly on purpose. That's part of the dialogue that is being created, that this is a futuristic thing. Orkney is on the cutting edge of renewable energy. The cutting edge is at the front. It's out there. The cutting edge isn't in the middle of the story. It's at the beginning of the story. It's at the cusp of a new story. So this dialogizing about landscape makes, and it remakes, and it constantly remakes the new, the next. Even further, though, I want to pull out a couple other little bits from Basso here to talk about how we dialogize not just about the landscape. I'll explain a little bit what I mean about that after I give you a quote or two. This again is Basso talking about how people in the Western Apache, the CBQ Apache, how they make meaning together. The ethnographer comes to appreciate that features of the local landscape, no less than utterances exchanged in forms of daily discourse, acquire value and significance by virtue of the ideational systems with which they are apprehended and construed. A lot of jargon in there, a lot of vocab in there, but basically saying people don't just make meaning with the utterances about the landscape, they actually make meaning with the landscape itself. The landscape dialogizes, and the landscape mythologizes. As an archaeologist, you know what I'm talking about. You said that you don't have access to the stories necessarily, but what do you have access to as an archaeologist? And again, I used to be an archaeologist for a living, so I sort of know what you're going to say, but you say it.
Well, I have access to two things that I perceive as facts, i.e. data, but I'm becoming really interested in the nature of truth, which I'll talk to you about later. And I have access to my imagination.
Mm. And somewhere in the negotiation of those two things, you're making a narrative.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, you're making a narrative. Not a narrative just about the landscape in which you're working, but a narrative of the landscape in which you're working. You narrate that landscape. As archaeologists, and I'm going to claim that I'm still an archaeologist, so pretend that I'm sharing that identity at the present moment. As archaeologists, we narrate the landscape. We don't just narrate about it or narrate with it. We narrate the landscape itself. The landscape becomes part of the dialogue. The landscape becomes the dialogic vehicle. In order to make meanings happen in that process, there has to be some shared ideological, ideational system. If I am speaking French and you are speaking Norwegian, chances are very good that we're not going to have a whole lot of straightforward communication. We need to share some common language in order to communicate back and forth. Language is nothing at that level but a shared ideational and ideological system. You have to translate from the one to the other. Symbolically constituted, socially transmitted, and individually applied, such systems operate to place flexible constraints on how the physical environment can and should be known. The shared dialogic communicative system shapes how you must know the landscape, and shapes how you must know with the landscape. Okay? But Basso keeps going. How its occupants can and should be found to act. Socially constitutive. The landscape narrates to us not just things about it, but things about us interacting with it. And how the doings of both can and should be discerned to affect each other. Landscape isn't a separate thing from us. Landscape is a thing that, because we narrate it, and because it narrates to us, we are inextricably linked to it. We are inextricably interactive with it. It is part of how we mythologize. It's part of how we dialogize. Therefore, it is constitutive not just of itself, but of us. Okay? By way of illustration, I'm quoting Basso again here, by way of illustration, I've attempted to show here that Western Apache conceptions of the land work in specific ways to influence Apache's conceptions of themselves, and vice versa, and that the two together work to influence patterns of social action. Ultimately, what Basso comes to, and ultimately what I want to present to you, is that those patterns of social action aren't just fringe traits that kind of describe who we are. They are fundamental to it. They are our identity. Orkney's identity is ultimately what you're talking about. I mean, you may not want to phrase it that way. I'll probably make her phrase that way because I'm one of the people who's going to be reading her PhD. But Orkney's identity is being made and remade constantly, not just by the news reports about the sea snake and the oyster, and about how they both went into administration, but in the process of the making, the deployment of the narratives about that. Orkney is being made and remade constantly. Bakhtin said that the utterance is the most fundamental unit of communication. Part of what I want to put out here is that the landscape utters. It constantly utters to us, okay? And we then make with it. And we then are made in that process. That's all I wanted to say today. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Mike. So again, a very interesting discussion. It was lovely the way it links in nicely with Becky's talk. Do we have any questions for Mike?
I always try to speak quickly and shut up quick because the Q&A is the most important and interesting part for me. So,
I think that means he wants lots of questions.
What was the name of the book?
oh, it's called Wisdom Sits in Places.
Oh, yeah, got that. Yep, got that.
I'll pass that along actually if you want to take the biblio from the front.
That's fine.
Yeah, it's a fantastic book. It's actually not terribly new. It's been around for the better part of a couple decades now. But the ideas that Basso crystallizes in there, and his prose itself is just very beautiful. So I think it conveys very well. So I keep going back to it. Yeah.
So you were talking quite a bit about Basso and about the Apache. I wondered if you could say something about whether you think that different people have different relationships to the land, because obviously the Apache are a particular kind of people.
Absolutely. One of the things that Basso discusses in the book is how particular landscape is used. I phrased that poorly. The very particular way in which landscape is used among the Western Apache. He talks about place names and how place names become these conveyors of narrative that become socially constitutive. And so that doesn't happen in a place like Orkney. That doesn't happen in a place like Burlington, Vermont, where I currently live. But the communication about and with landscape that does so powerfully constitute, I think is very, very widespread. I'm not going to say universal because I'm an anthropologist. We can never say that. But it's incredibly widespread. I'll give you an example from where I live right now. In Vermont, has anybody ever been to Vermont? Just me? You've been to Vermont? Why on earth were you?
I live in Rhode Island. So.
Oh, okay. Well, there you go. So you came up for
I
some
drive
syrup.
through it all the
Doubtless,
time.
yeah. For skiing or syrup or both. That's
Well,
kind of.
actually, I'm from Canada, so I drive.
Oh. Vermont is a hilly place. We have, well, the Green Mountains run right through the middle of the state. That's where the state gets its name. Green Mountain, Vermont. Wind power is something that people have been debating about for a long time. Vermont considers itself a very green state in a lot of different ways, including ecological energy-wise. There are a lot of people in Vermont who like the concept of renewable energy. There are a lot of people in Vermont who like the concept of the traditional landscape. In Vermont, when you take a wind turbine and you put it on a ridgetop, that alters the landscape and the story that it tells about Vermontness and Vermont identity. Vermont identity is, for a lot of people, about a clean, untouched, non-human landscape. These are all fictional landscapes. There's no such thing as a non-human landscape on this planet. And we're even getting close to other planets too in that regard. But you can't look up at a ridgetop in Vermont and see a wind turbine for some people. That narrates a very discordant story. That tells a false story about Vermont. That's a myth in the incorrect, untrue sense. The other narrative that says we want renewable energy, we want to be free of fossil fuels, says wind power is obviously going to be a useful thing and a good thing and a thing that we want. And there's even a sort of third voice that talks about neither of those, but talks strictly about the aesthetics of a wind turbine and says they're very beautiful things. Just look at the grace with which they move and the soft sort of susurrating noise they make. So it's purely an aesthetic voice about them. But all of them are narrating, or trying to narrate about the same thing. Vermont has a law, and Vermont is not unique in this in the States, but it's not the dominant position. But it has law that you cannot have a billboard. Billboards are illegal in my state. The reason that they're illegal in Vermont is because people want to be able to look slightly up and see nature. They don't want signage at that level. When you cross over by car from Vermont into New York, the first thing that hits you is billboard. And they're stark. And interestingly, the state of Vermont actually purchases a billboard space in New York to advertise Vermont. More than a little irony there, perhaps a hypocrisy if you wanted to dig into it a little bit. But the idea of keeping the visual landscape pristine and untouched, and again I'm putting those in academic air quotes, is a very strong narrative there. So renewable energy, which is another strong narrative, comes into conflict with that one. And so, to get back to the question you asked me 58 minutes ago when I started rambling, the narration and the mythologizing, the dialogizing about landscape, I think is happening very strongly in the same way there. Not in exactly the same form, though, in terms of a place name, though.
Well, what you said about Vermont now I can recognize from Orkney. I just remember I have been in Vermont very briefly, but yeah, but all those voices about Orkney trying to tell the story about Orkney. The main stories that are being told now is one about Orkney being a place where many time periods are visible simultaneously. From the Neolithic via the Vikings to now. And the second one is that unspoilt, untouched, the sky fits the earth image. So those Vermont voices are arguing here as well.
Absolutely, absolutely. And it's that stretch of undifferentiated pastness that you get in a place like Maes Howe, where they sell Viking plastic helmets in the gift shop.
Yeah.
Which really sort of disallows you from thinking about Vikingness or Neolithicness in separation, in isolation here.
Yeah.
Vermont does the same thing. There is a non-discontinuous past that should be discontinuous. I do a lot of research on maple syrup making. I talk with sugar makers. I see people going, "How did you do that?" I get a lot of free syrup. There are certain incentives for doing this kind of research. But sugaring, as the process of making maple syrup is known, is one of these places where people talk an awful lot about their interaction with the landscape because you are out there among the trees, you're literally drilling holes in them and getting the sap out. And so it's a very landscape-oriented thing, and it's also a very heritage and past-oriented thing. This is something that we have done for our entire span of Vermont. Well, the we in this case is European immigration. The process of sugaring was being done by Native American groups, primarily Abenaki in Vermont, long before white people showed up. But that seeming cultural discontinuity is almost always elided. People just sort of skip right over that, and they create one narrative past that says sugaring has been continuous throughout Vermont's history, even before it was Vermont. Well, how do you have a Vermont history even before it was Vermont? There was no thing such as Vermont at that point. And so you get the similar kind of it's a cherry picking. People pick and choose bits of narrative and they stitch them together into a myth, a mythology that works, that tells them a story, that makes an identity for them, that is comfortable.
This may be too different from what we've been talking about, but one of the things that's recently interesting me is the sort of myth, if it is a myth, about indigenous peoples and the way they treat animal resources, because we're quite encouraged to believe that indigenous people lived, and some continue to live, in a very sensitive harmony, where they're very careful not to harvest more than the environment will stand. But reading recently about East Greenland, and people who live there, it's not obvious that was the case. They caught as many seals as they could, but with the weapons they had at their disposal, they were just less destructive than we were when we turned up. I mean, is this a myth, or do you think indigenous people have always had an understanding that what you harvest today, you can't harvest tomorrow?
And they are fewer. There's fewer of them too.
They require them.
Well, that's right.
Mm.
Was the fact that the environment was more stable a comment on their technology and numbers, or do they have a genuinely different understanding of the environment than we've had?
Both and more. There is a very romantic, literary-based notion of, well, the concept of the noble savage is being applied here, the sense of those folks did things a better way because they are less civilized in ways that make them more pure. That's hooey. That's another technical term. It's a problematic notion because it oversimplifies in the exact same way that looking at them and saying, well, they're just red savages, oversimplifies. To pretend that a group of people any group of people is going to include, I'm going to start that over. To pretend that any group of people is not going to include some small percentage of those people who are jerks is false. It's just a basic human truth. 10% of the people in the room right now are jerks. I'm one of them, okay? I'll just fess up myself. That's just the nature of human being. So to pretend that a group of people can be describable as having this obviously better and more serene and more fluid and more purposeful and more anything approach to interaction with animal resources, for example, is an oversimplification.
I've got a question back just on that, because I work on sort of pre-farming people. But one thing is, I mean, you can't say indigenous people. I mean, there's 1,000,001 ways, and any indigenous people today are so conflicted because of their interacting with their 21st century indigenous peoples. And the same is true if you go back to pre-farming peoples. But I'm interested in the creation of myth and the values that we put on it. And you mentioned that it's got a connotation perhaps of falseness and things. But you know, well, I've been working with novelists to present the past, and actually academics today, we preference academic writing, but storytellers were the academics of the past. And I am wondering why we value academic writing and not fiction, both present day fiction, which when I was briefly and possibly misguidedly an academic, I used in my teaching, and so sort of current fiction, and then what we see as past fiction. But the one thing that I have learnt is that my academic writing is also fiction. Is it a power thing to do with the invention of the printed press? Because we privilege the printed word, and only a few of us have access to the printed word nowadays, whereas anybody can tell a story.
I think that's part of it, absolutely. Power is always going to come into play. That's another one of those things where any percentage of people are going to be jerks. Jerks try to claim power. I'm oversimplifying there, but it's not entirely false. I think something like the printing press and the privileging of the printed word is as much effect and symptom as it is sort of causal. I mean, it creates, but it recreates the effect.
or it's created. We have such an elite of academia today, so that it's great to say, I published an academic book, but in my particular university, they didn't like me publishing non-academic works. And if I'd strayed into fiction, which I would say all my writing was anyway, then I would have been out on my ear sooner than I was.
Well, ultimately it becomes an epistemological question. Academia epistemologizes the way science epistemologizes because of the development of academia, or at least the flavor of academia that we're sitting in right now. It pretends that there is such a thing as universalizable understanding.
Yeah.
And when you have universalizable understanding, then you have authority that can come from somewhere other than the people doing the making of the knowledge.
Yeah. And that's only because our world is bigger, isn't it?
That's one of the
Than it
reasons.
was. If you were, which I'm interested in living and coping with environmental change at the Stones of Stennis, which was massive, you had to explain that in your own terms and think about the future in your world, although we now know that Stonehenge was created from Orkney, so that the whole north-south thing is turned on its head if you go back far enough. Your world is smaller than it is today.
Yeah, scale definitely comes into play, absolutely. When your conceptual world, when it gets bigger than your perceptual world, a lot changes. And the way people narrate their world changes pretty radically too. Yeah.
It's really interesting. I'll have to drink over the beer.
I won't argue with that.
Any more comments or questions? It's probably one of the most engaging Q&A sessions I've been at.
I like to make them do some of the work. So. All right, well, thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you.